I want to talk to you today about a concept that I've come to think of as Goldilocks and the 3 pelvic floors. Most people, when they're talking about pelvic floor dysfunction, and a lot of discussions that I hear about any sort of pelvic floor dysfunction, like leaking or anything else, the immediate assumption is that your pelvic floor is weak and you need to strengthen it. And this is not correct. We know now that you can have there is such a thing as a pelvic floor that is just right. There is such a thing as a weak pelvic floor, and there is such a thing as a hypertensive pelvic floor. And hence why I like to call it Goldilocks and the 3 pelvic floors. If you're having pelvic floor issues, it doesn't necessarily mean that your pelvic floor is weak. There is such a thing as a weak pelvic floor. There is such a thing as a pelvic floor that's kind of descended. If we think about the pelvic floor, it's like a hammock that sits in the bottom of our pelvis, and it supports all of our abdominal organs. It's there as like a layer of support, holding everything up. That pelvic floor can be weak and descended, and that can be a source of lots of pelvic floor problems, and this is particularly common after childbirth, and it's absolutely an issue, and it absolutely needs to be dealt with. You can also have a pelvic floor that's just right, that sits at just the right height in the pelvis and has just the right amount of tone, but you can also have a hypertonic pelvic floor that's overly tense, that's tight and contracted, and has too much tone in it. At the end of the day, all the pelvic floor is just a group of muscles, and just like every other muscle in the body, they can be overactive and they can be tight, and that can cause us lots of problems. It can also lead to leaking. It can also lead to weakness in the pelvic floor. It can lead to pain, especially during sex. It can lead to urinary frequency, difficulty emptying the bladder. It can lead to a whole host of problems. And it's definitely not a good thing. It's not a case of the tighter the better, the stronger the better. And I also work with a number of pelvic floor physios. I'm not a pelvic floor physio, I'm a trainer, and I don't replace the work of a pelvic floor physio. It's incredibly important to seek treatment from somebody who can do an internal exam, assessment and treatment, which I can't do. But our work as trainers, especially with the pre and postnatal population, should complement that of physiotherapists. I do work with lots of physiotherapists, as I was saying, and what they tell me is that actually clinically what they see is way more incidence of hypertonic pelvic floors than of weak pelvic floors. It's way more common nowadays with the amount of not just the amount of participation, female participation in sport, that's an all-time high. As great as sport is, and as much as we want to do, we want people to participate in sports, it can lead to hypertension in the pelvic floor, especially if we're not using good strategies for lifting, for breathing, for all kinds of things, for impact, for all kinds of areas of activity in sports. So there's the participation in sports, but there's also stress. Modern life has become far more stressful. We have high levels of stress in our lives, and this can create tension all over the body, but in particular in the diaphragm and in the pelvic floor and in certain core muscles. It can cause a lot of imbalance. So if you have, one of the major things that I hear is that, I hear of trainees who come to me with pelvic floor issues, and they present a whole bunch of symptoms that sounds a lot like they have a hypertensive pelvic floor, but yet they tell me, oh, my auntie or my cousin or my mother-in-law or whoever else who's a yoga practitioner who did a course for like pre-postnatal training in the 1980s told me that I need to do kegels, or I need to strengthen my pelvic floor, I need to do pelvic floor exercise. And this may be true, but it sounds to me like this particular woman has a hyperactive pelvic floor, And I can't know that. I'm getting pretty good at guessing it based on what she tells me and the symptoms that she's presenting, that she reports to me. But the only way to really know is to go and get checked by a pelvic floor physio who can do an internal exam and who can tell you for sure. And this is where people don't seem to understand. They'll say, well, what's the point of going to a pelvic floor physio? All they're going to do is tell me to do kegels. Well, a good pelvic floor physio will tell you to do a hell of a lot more than kegels. And they may tell you that don't do kegels because you have a hypertensive pelvic floor. Or maybe you know how to contract your pelvic floor, but it's not timing properly with the rest of your system. So this is why it's so important to go and see a pelvic floor physio who's fully trained and who can assess all of those things, because simply doing kegels and squeezing your pelvic floor may not be the answer. Maybe that you have hypertensive pelvic floor and you need to release those muscles, or that you need to do a whole bunch of other things, breathing techniques, postural techniques, all kinds of things to fix the issue, and you can't know that without doing the internal exam. So the major takeaway, I went off on a bit of a rant there, but the major takeaway of this video is pelvic floor dysfunction does not necessarily equal weak pelvic floors, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to do pelvic floor contractions or kegels in order to rectify the matter. So please be aware that there is such a thing as a hypertonic or overactive pelvic floor, and major kind of symptoms and signs of that are any kind of pain, any kind of delay during urination, difficulty emptying the bladder, urinary frequency. When that's combined with somebody who does large amounts of sport, then that's then especially lifting weights or high impact sports, then it's more likely that she has a hypertensive pelvic floor than just a purely weak pelvic floor. This is a simplified look at the matter, but I hope it just helps you understand that it doesn't all just go into one category. There are different ways of looking at the situation, and pelvic floors can be weak, but they can also be too tight and strong and hypertensive. Hope that helps. If you have any questions, leave them below in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them.